Thank you, Cameron. So everyone, I want to give us just a little bit of space to come into this together. To make this program a success, I would like for all of you to be present and to bring your full selves. So please just take a moment right now to allow yourself to fully arrive into this space with us. Allow the dust to settle in your mind. Bring your attention to your body, your breath, this present moment. You have arrived. Welcome. You may have noticed our land acknowledgements in our intros. I welcome your sacred connections to the lands on which you were conceived, the lands that hosted your births, and the lands of your ancestors. I acknowledge that the land I'm on today is not my own. It is the homeland of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples from whom it was stolen through colonialism and domination. We acknowledge those peoples as stewards of the land with a long history before us. I wish for us all to hold that reality in our bodies, our hearts, and our spirits, so we may move forward toward liberation together. And in a moment, I'll welcome you all to share your own land acknowledgements based on where you are. We've introduced ourselves, but we'd also love to hear from you to get a sense of who's in the room. So if you could introduce yourself in the chat, just include your name, your location, your monthly meeting, a land acknowledgement, if you're led, and sort of one word to describe how you're coming into this session. I'll just pause for a moment to give everyone a minute to enter that into the chat. And as you're introducing yourself, I want to share just a few sort of process and technology guidelines for our time together this evening. As a co-facilitator with Cameron, one of my roles in this session is to hold space for our group process. First, I want to share some guidelines. Be sure to mute yourself and type your questions or comments in the chat. And following Quaker protocol as much as possible, try to share once until others have had a chance to share, and use time equitably. We'll respond to any questions or comments in the chat as we are able, but we do have limited time and a lot of content to get through tonight, so we may not get to everyone. We'll also be, throughout our content, after each section, we'll be sharing reflection prompts in the chat, and we'll give more instructions on what to do with those later. But we're hoping folks will use those prompts to sort of reflect silently for a few moments on the content we've presented, to journal a little bit, or to write down just your reactions to what we're sharing with you. And then you'll have a chance at the end of the workshop in small groups to sort of process and reflect together. I want to introduce another important process piece for our session today. We're going to use a protocol called Oops and Ouch. If in the course of our session, you feel injured by something that someone says, please feel free to write ouch in the chat. I'll give you an opportunity to explain in the chat, and then offer the opportunity for the friend responsible for the ouch to either clarify or simply apologize by writing oops. I want to emphasize that oops and ouch are meant to be used for words or comments that injure, not just words that make one uncomfortable. And this protocol is really meant to give space and voice to noticing patterns of oppressive and harmful speech and behavior as part of this work of reckoning with racism, of reflecting and learning and acting to change entrenched systems of advantage and disadvantage. When you're done introducing yourself, I do hope you'll also take a moment to sign our FCNL workshop guest book that I'll put in the chat a few times during the course of the session. If you put in your email to that form, that'll allow us to follow up with you after this session to provide additional resources for your learning, reflection, and action taking. I'm going to start sharing my screen now and go over just a little bit of what we have planned this evening so everyone knows what to expect. So here is a little bit of our goals and overview of our evening together. As you may have seen from the workshop description, first we'll be starting off with conveying the historical foundations of systemic racism and its contemporary manifestations. We'll move into talking about some of the specific policy issues that FCNL works on and ways that we are working to challenge systemic racism through specific policy advocacy. We'll then have a little section on preparing to move from learning about this content and these realities to taking action on them with FCNL or beyond. And we'll close with a chance to connect with other friends in small groups to sort of continue reflecting on this content and sharing ideas for how you might be led to continue taking action on this work. All right. Next, I want to just talk a little bit about FCNL for folks who may be more or less familiar with the organization. So FCNL, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, is a nonpartisan Quaker advocacy organization that lobbies Congress and the administration for peace and justice. We work on a variety of sorry, friends, I froze for a moment. I'm back. We work on a variety of policy issues that run the gamut. We have a large foreign policy portfolio promoting peace, diplomacy, and working in particular regions of the world. We also have a big domestic portfolio working on environmental issues, on immigration, on Native American concerns. And what we'll be focusing on tonight is our justice reform and voter suppression and election integrity work. That's a little bit about who we are and what we do. We're a team of professional lobbyists and organizers, and also a network of grassroots activists all around the country supporting us in this lobbying work, working together to change policy through speaking truth to power in Congress. I also want to talk a little bit about our investment in anti-racist practice as an organization. We have started more and more bringing a racial justice lens to the issues we advocate for and highlighting how all of our different policy issues do have, they do impact marginalized communities in different ways. We also, between our two major virtual lobbying events this year, brought more than 1,000 people together to advocate to end police violence. And internally, we began an intensive focus with staff and governors to address systemic racism and white supremacy as it manifests in our organization. So we're looking at doing the work both internally and externally. Also want to share just a little bit of opening framing for this content tonight. It's really a space to learn more about the foundations of systemic racism and how we can all learn more about them and move from learning to action. There may be people here not yet doing this work in their communities. There may be people who have led this work in their communities for a long time, and everyone in between in this session. And for that reason, I want to highlight that the impact of these conversations and this work is different for different people. So I hope that that sort of will help us all maintain some awareness that when we speak tonight, we're not just speaking into this sort of Zoom void, but we're actually sharing with real people with real experiences. So just to be mindful of the impacts that our words can have on one another. We want to acknowledge also that this work and these conversations can be quite challenging. And it's a hard year. We're talking about hard topics. And we know that many of us don't always have the awareness to fully include the wholeness of all of us in our interactions. So we trust and give permission that you will take care of yourself during this session. You will do what you need to do. If that is closing your eyes and moving about, if that is muting your speaker and taking a break or turning off your video, we trust you are doing what works best for you. And finally, folks may be in really different places in their relationship to racial justice work in their communities. And we are really here to learn and to inspire one another and to hold one another accountable to the vision for racial justice and equity in society we hold. And with that, I'll pass it to Cameron to get us into our content for this evening.
Thank you, Bobby, for framing this for us. All right. All right, everyone. So before we can talk about where we are today when it comes to race and the issues that we see today with democracy and our justice system, we have to first look back. And I feel like this is a big reason why we have so much division in our nation is that we don't have a common understanding of where we were. So we're not having a common understanding of where we're going forward. So I'm just going to give a quick brief interview about the very foundations of systemic racism when we talk about this term. Some of you this may be the first time, and some of you may be very familiar with these systems. So I'm just going to do a brief overview, but I think it's very important that we get that down so that we understand how this is built and manifested in the last 400 years. So, to plain and simple, the dehumanization of Black people is nothing new. There has been centuries of anti-Blackness established worldwide. Over centuries, false notions that white people were inherently smarter, more capable, or more human than non-white people became accepted worldwide. This categorization of people by race then became a justification for European colonization and the subsequent enslavement of Black people. The concept of race established a new hierarchy, invented on what many considered science at the time. Looking at skull size and what we now know as pseudoscience and racist science. In fact, the terms race and species were interchangeable until about the 18th century. Even before that, we see the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493, where the Pope established a spiritual, political, and legal justification for colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. Now, Black people are affected in America by white supremacy's logic of slavery. Blackness represents otherness, the antithesis to whiteness in the minds of white supremacy. Whiteness represents purity and righteousness. So Black people then subsequently become viewed as animals who deserve enslavement because we're wild or savages. And then these systems of oppression try to strip us of our humanity and our autonomy, and then later determine us to be 3/5 of a human being. These are all forms of control, the way that early America interacts with Black people, taking away Black people from our cultural histories, from our lands, from our languages, and our separated families. I'm not able to know my ancestry unless I spit in a tube, it erase all identity, and that makes enslavement easier. America has long categorized Black people as unintelligent, lazy, violent, criminals. And so the criminalization of Blackness then serves as a logical extension of Blackness as property. So if you call Black people criminals, then that allows for control of Black bodies, especially male Black bodies, who society has perpetually deemed as threats. If we look at our current prison industrial complex and the system of mass incarceration, us Black people were originally enslaved through chattel slavery, but now this is manifested into the new form of the prison system. It's a re-enslavement because slavery is still legal in due to the 13th Amendment in the Constitution, still to this day, in the form of forced labor, so prisons. Since this negative view of Black people has been so deeply ingrained into our society, we can see how in modern times, all lives matter. It's kind of a visceral reaction if someone utters Black Lives Matter. And there's a reason for this, because it is so woven into our society. It's the very foundation of America. So Black Lives Matter is a threatening statement because it goes against our foundational systems. Our America never was designed to assert that Black people have America. That was never the intention of our founding fathers. It was never intended that Black people have the same treatment of everyone else. That was not the original purpose of this country. So saying Black Lives Matter actively defies white supremacy and a racial hierarchy. So it's kind of, again, it's like a gut knee-jerk reaction to, people will say all lives matter because saying Black Lives Matter just goes too far in a moment where specificity is required. But just, it also serves as a easy way to write off conversation. It's a false sense of solidarity, where I'm not racist, all lives matter, but that statement is a way to write off not having to understand or learn further about systems of oppression or having to do any additional work. And it does not do anything to shake the status quo of white supremacy. Native people in America have historically and continually have been affected by white supremacy's logic of genocide. So white supremacy's logic of genocide says that Indigenous people must disappear. They must always be disappearing, in fact, in order for white people to have a rightful claim over the land. White people then become the rightful inheritors of empty land if Native people don't exist. And that concept of manifest destiny that God has chosen Europeans for this land can only work if Native people are vanished and no longer exist and the land is empty. So that's why we see I didn't say this in my intro, but before I was at FCNL, I was a teacher in South Dakota and Rosebud Reservation. And I taught 100% Lakota Sioux students. And the reactions of me coming home and talking to people about my work were, Native people still exist? Do they live in teepees? All of this is very much erasure. Native people, we are here and we're alive and still present, but white supremacy's logic of genocide is intentional, that Native people have to disappear. All right, so that was my very, very brief introduction of the foundations of white supremacy. So Bobby, can you share a little bit about what the reflection prompts are?
Yeah, definitely. So as we go through each section of content, like I said earlier, we'll have a few prompts in the chat and a few moments of silence for folks to just reflect on what they heard and notice what's coming up for them as they learn or refresh content in this area. So for this section, I'll put the prompts in the chat and also on the slide. But if we could all just take a few minutes of silence to think about these prompts and to jot down what's rising for us. You'll use that thinking and that note-taking later on in small breakout groups to convene with other friends. So I'll just invite us into those 2 minutes of silence or so. And as with Quaker queries, don't feel like you have to respond to every single part of the prompt. If there's a particular one that sticks out to you, focus in on that and jot down some thoughts on what it's bringing up for you. That'll be true throughout this session. And also we'll be sending out these prompts in a follow-up email to folks who fill out our guest book form. So they're a little bit of a to-go product from this workshop as well that you can continue to sit with and ponder. I think I will pass it back to Cameron to continue moving us along though.
Thank you, Bobby. All right, so now that we've talked about the very, very basic foundations of white supremacy, we're now going to talk about how it's manifested into modern forms, specifically in the 3 areas that I focus on my work at FCNL. However, it has manifested in many, multiple forms, but these are just the 3 that we're going to be highlighting today, as this is the extent of mainly what FCNL's justice and election integrity issues have been centered on. So we're first going to be talking about policing and the issue of issues in policing and what FCNL has been doing in the area of policing reform. So first, again, I like to start with the beginning to know how we got to where we are today. So first, I'm going to talk about the racist history of policing in the United States. So slave patrols were the first police in the South. The slave patrols were a small group of men formed in the Carolina colonies in 1704. And they carried weapons as they rode on horseback in a small group. The main duties of this small horseback group was to chase and hunt down escaped enslaved people, terrorize enslaved communities as a form of control, and keep order among plantation owners. So we really see this as the very first manifestation of policing, and especially a policing of Black bodies. Then we see in Boston in 1838, the first real official city police force. And it was established as a response to tensions between newly arrived German and Irish immigrants and original settlers from England and the Netherlands. So the original settlers from England and the Netherlands argued that the new immigrants, the German and Irish immigrants, were the cause of higher crime rates and the ruin of American society. By the 1880s, almost every major city in the country had a police force. And we see this original interaction between the original settlers and the immigrants in Boston as the foundation for the continuation of seeing immigrants as threats, as well as slave patrols being an extension of Blackness as property. So that's a very quick foundation of policing, but it kind of gives us a good idea of how we got to where we are today when it comes to race and policing. So currently today, there are about 18,000 state and local police jurisdictions in the United States, and there are no national standards that they must follow. So there is no unifying standards or guidelines between all 18,000 police jurisdictions in the United States. We see in America that cities and communities spend far more in policing than most other services, such as welfare and housing. So roughly one of every $10 spent by your county or your township goes to policing most likely, and about one of every $100 spent by the states goes to policing as well. The Pentagon's 1033 program is a military grade equipment transfer program. It has given over $7.4 billion of Defense Department property to more than 8,000 law enforcement agencies. And we see this transfer of military equipment to local law enforcement agencies assisting in this growing and alarming trend of the militarization of the police. And we see that in police forces, a lot of times veterans are very attractive for the police force as well. So militarization of the police has kind of led to a cultural shift of law enforcement's perceived role in society from being that of guardian to now that of warrior, as officers are dressed in battle gear, and psychologically, when they are dressed in this combat gear, officers are more likely to view community members as threats, a hyper paramilitary approach to policing. We see that in Black communities, they are completely over-policed. Black neighborhoods are over-policed in surveillance and social control, but under-policed simultaneously when it comes to emergency services, overwhelmingly. Most police departments and officers, like I was talking about, or take that paramilitary approach to law enforcement and sometimes adopt that us versus them attitude towards Black communities. Again, the very foundations of systemic racism say that Blackness is the antithesis to whiteness, and that has been very ingrained into our society since the beginning. We see over-policing when it comes to searching cars and drivers. The bar for searching Black and Latino drivers is lower than white drivers, even though white drivers were more likely to have contraband in their vehicle. For arrests for suspicion of a crime, just for suspicion, when someone is arrested for no specific reason and released without a formal charge, Black people were arrested at a rate of 5.36 times that of white people for suspicion of a crime. And Black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, notwithstanding comparable usage rates. So it has nothing to do with Black people smoke more weed than white people. It is simply how our system is designed to criminalize Black people. So the high number of deaths at the hands of the police, and I'm going to be talking about potentially triggering material. So if you feel like you might walk around or do something to take care of yourself, please do that, because I'm going to be talking about some pretty harsh realities that we are facing in our nation. So police nationwide have shot and killed nearly the same number of people annually for the last 5 years, and that's more than 1,000 people a year. So for the last 5 years, over 5,000 people have been killed at the hands of the police. There were only 18 days in 2020 where police did not kill someone. That's only 18 days last year where someone did not lose their lives at the hand of the police. 58% of the killings last year, that's 626 deaths, were traffic stops or police responses to mental health crises or situations where the person was reportedly not threatening anyone with a gun. That's 58% of what we would like to see preventable interactions with the police. And quite frankly, there is no accountability in our current system. 98.3% of killings by police from 2013 to 2020 have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. It's nearly impossible to charge an officer with a criminal crime. And there is no official database for the deaths at the hands of the police. These numbers that we get of over 1,000 deaths, we really have to rely on third-party organizations and news outlets such as The Guardian's, The Counted. I know Washington Post does a yearly wrap-up of police violence, but there's no official database where we can access this information, and that is a real problem. Black and Native people are the most likely to be killed by police. Although half of the people shot and killed by police are white, Black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate. It's really that disproportionate rate that we're focusing on that is important. It's alarming. Black people make up less than 13% of the entire United States population, but are killed by the police at almost 3 times the rate of white Americans. So in 2020, Black people were 28% of those killed by the police, despite only being 13% of the population. And Black people killed by the police are twice more likely to be unarmed compared to white people. Police violence is a leading cause of death for young Black men in the United States. Over the life course, about 1 in every 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by the cops. At current levels of risk, Black men face about a 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by the police in their lifetime. Black men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men. Black women are 1.4 times more likely to be killed by police than white women. Native men are between 1.2 and 1.7 times more likely to be killed by police than white men, and Native women are between 1.1 and 2.1 times more likely to be killed by police than white women. So now that we have framed the alarming issue that we are continuing to see in our country, now I'm going to talk about responses for change that we have been seeing as well. So first, I want to talk about the grassroots level and the defund movement that we see happening on the grassroots level. So the defund movement argues that investing in public health and social services rather than the police is a more appropriate and effective means to meet the public safety needs of a community. Defund believes by distributing these funds to essential social services and community programs, the idea is that the needs of the community can be more directly addressed without the harmful effects of policing, especially for BIPOC people, and BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who disproportionately suffer from police brutality and violence every year. So it's not about abolition, it's very much about reallocation. So supporters of defunding the police argue that efforts to reform have largely failed to actually combat police violence in a meaningful way or effective way. An example is Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, and that police department already implemented body cams. They already implemented bias training. So a lot of people in the defund movement don't say that the issue is systemic. It's way deeper than just needing reform. It needs some overhaul. They argue that it would decrease crime, by having better mental health services in low-income areas where there's a lot of trauma. Demilitarization of police can also reduce escalation and tensions between interactions of community members and police officers. And again, it does not mean to abolish the police. It means taking a lot of the funding and reallocating it to a different source. We've seen a lot of success for defund on the local level, especially in cities. Like New York, Los Angeles, and Boston have all taken on defund measures since 2020. Again, we have been seeing most of this change on the local level, and it's still continuing. So in 2020, just to show you what's been going on, 27 states adopted new police oversight and reform laws, according to the National Conference of State Legislators. And that's a database that we can use to keep tracking all the reform legislation that's coming out from the states. In November last year, voters approved 17 ballot members in 6 states to rein in police officers. And again, the defund movement is to allocate funding for police departments to community service is very strong on the local level. FCNL is Friends Committee on National Legislation. We deal with the national level and the federal government, but we do believe that the work on the grassroots level should continue on the local and state level, as the majority of police funding does come from the local and state level and not the federal government. So what can the federal government do? What can we do on a national stage about policing? So at FCNL, we have been advocating for the last year for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, HR 1280. It would implement many important reforms to help transform policing across the nation by really setting national standards for all police departments to follow. If you all remember earlier, I said 18,000 police jurisdictions in the United States, and there are no unifying national standards that they have to follow, basic standards. If a police department chooses not to implement the forms, say the Justice and Policing Act passes the House, passes the Senate, it's in law, and if a police department chooses not to implement the reforms in the act, that department is at risk of losing their federal funding. So that's where the leverage comes for the federal government, is its funding power for the states. While the majority of change to policing must and is occurring on the local level, we do believe the national government has a role to play. And again, we believe at FCNL that the federal government should at least be setting universal national standards of policing. That's just one thing it could do, but that's one important thing that it can do. We cannot have those 18,000 police jurisdictions having completely different approaches to policing and continuing to have no unified basic standards. So as Bobby mentioned earlier, we had 2 really big events where we had advocates from all over the nation lobby virtually in Congress, and our legislative ask for the congressional visits that we had were to pass the reforms included in the Justice and Policing Act, HR 1280. So we advocated this year for the passage of banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. Chokeholds, Derek Chauvin used a chokehold to murder George Floyd, and a no-knock warrant was used as a vehicle to enter Breonna Taylor's home and led to her subsequent murder. We're also asking to reform the 1033 program that assists with the hyper-militarization of police departments that we're seeing. So we want the Pentagon to stop sending money just to police departments. We want the Department of Defense to stop sending military equipment to police departments. We're asking for reforming qualified immunity, though we would actually like to see qualified immunity eventually go. But in our current political climate in the Senate, it's very hard to get Republican senators to even want to touch the bill because of the issue of qualified immunity. Police unions have immense, tremendous power. And this is one of the provisions that has really made a lot of senators and members want to not shake the boat too much and upset their base. So eventually we would like to see qualified immunity go, but for now we're asking what's in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to reform qualified immunity. And we'd like to increase the use of force standard for lethal force nationwide and mandate de-escalation techniques before use of force nationwide. I touched on this a little bit, but FCNL believes that the JPA doesn't do nearly all that needs to be done. We're not, we're not blinded by the legislation, I will say. We want a lot more, and at the same time, we don't want another year to pass without federal legislation to set those national standards. What FCNL does is important work, but it's not the only work that needs to be done. There's much work that needs to be done on so many levels. And when these reforms are enacted, we aren't going to stop there. We're going to be pushing for more and more reforms in policing. It's just an opportunity for Congress to take a first step of many necessary steps towards addressing police violence, which has been a historical and long injustice that Black Americans have suffered. There is momentum with this particular piece of legislation, as the bill has passed the House twice now. First last year in the 116th Congress, and it passed the beginning of March for our 117th Congress that we're in right now. Another piece of legislation that a lot of activists have been advocating for is the BREATHE Act on the national level. And basically what the BREATHE Act would do would take what the defund and local movements are doing and put it on that national stage. It is a much stronger bill. It would, go as far as abolishing some federal police departments, such as ICE. and it covers a much wider range of policies. And it has not been introduced yet, unfortunately, but at FCNL, we will be reviewing it and looking at potential strategies moving forward with that bill.
All right, and we have gotten to the end of our policing section now. Again, quite a bit of content, so I want to give us about 4 minutes to just pause and think through some of these prompts. I'll put them in the chat as well, so folks have them accessible there. But first is, I mostly feel blank when discussing policing and racism because blank is supposed to elicit some reflection. Second, of course, what evidence is there to show that there is a crisis in policing? We just demonstrated a bit of evidence and wondering what stood out from that to you. And finally, also closing here with why is it important to hold individual police officers accountable for their actions? And why is it important to also change the systems that create the bias? So I'll invite us back to some quiet thinking and journaling for 3 minutes. We'll bring us back to content in about 30 seconds or so, or actually right when I'm finished speaking. But I do want to remind folks that we'll send these prompts out in a follow-up email if you sign our guest book, which I'll reshare in the chat in a moment. But also keep any notes that you might jot down in response to these prompts at hand, because you will have 15 minutes at the end in small groups to sort of debrief with other friends in this meeting and think through how you can take some of this information into some of your action to challenge systemic racism. Back to you, Cameron.
Right. All right, now that we've talked about policing, I just want to acknowledge that this is very, very heavy stuff. I know almost everybody here, if not everyone, has seen the murder of George Floyd. And it just sometimes feels like it's never ending. So I want to acknowledge that this is very hard work and it seems overbearing sometimes and overwhelming, but there really is so much power in our advocacy and what we can do. So, I feel energized by that every day. And I have to say this as I'm entering into voter suppression and all the horrible things that we are seeing currently and experiencing. So I'm going to talk to you all about, again, the historical foundations of voter suppression. None of this is new, you all. All of this has been building for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then I'm going to tell you like a little bit about how it's been manifesting in the modern day, and then what we've been doing again at FCNL to combat voter suppression. All right, again, very racist history of elections in our nation, and a very classist and sexist history of elections in our nation. As you all know, non-white men and women of all colors were not able to vote for the vast majority of American history. Why would they not be able to? This is very intentional, to silence the voices of people of color and women and strip them of power. If you can't vote in an American society, there really is no power. Being able to say that only white men historically can vote is a way to dictate and maintain a certain social order. It maintains that logic of white supremacy, that white men are supposed to be the stewards and leaders of society, and that God has deemed them to be so. So really restricting who has access to voting maintains that social order. And it ensures that people of color and women could not make decisions about themselves. This is the same reason why enslaved people weren't allowed to read, right? If you were given power, that means you're able to make choices. And then you might change the status quo and try to shake the system like we are currently. So that's a little bit about why access to voting was restricted in the first place. We see that all throughout American history. I'm going to go, and again, I wish I could talk in more detail about this with you all. It's just a shame that everything it deserves its own time to talk about, but we're trying to go through a whole big system of centuries. But I'm just going to do some quick highlights in American history of where we see voter access being restricted and how that continues into today. So after the American Revolution, only white land-owning men could vote. And I really want to emphasize that part of landowning. It was not all white men. It was only land-owning white men who could vote initially in this country. This establishes power in a social order, not only based on race, not only based on gender, but also race based on class. It wasn't, too long ago where a lot of English settlers didn't view some Irish immigrants or German immigrants as white. It became, or people who didn't have a lot of money or didn't own plantations, they were not considered white. It just became, when it became convenient to, have race be a unifying factor, then those people who were poor or immigrants then became accepted into whiteness. But in the beginning, it was very classist, very much if you didn't have money, you didn't have power. So the white men who also believed in this logic of white supremacy, that's why they came here to start a life based on that logic, were not okay with that. And they decided that they were going to fight for suffrage. So the first group of people that we really see fighting for voter access in America are poor white men. After that, after we see the Civil War, just really zooming quickly throughout time, after the Civil War, we now see voting access expanded to Black men. So now men can vote, white and Black men. I'm going to tell you not all men, and I'll explain in a second, but Black and white men could vote after the Civil War. We have the 13th Amendment that established many Black people as free from slavery. Then the 14th Amendment, which it says anyone born in the United States is a citizen. So then you have the 15th Amendment come out in 1870 that grants Black men the right to vote. And in the 15th Amendment, it declares in our Constitution that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So we'll see how that's being broken in modern days as well. So the reason I didn't say all men are able to vote after the Civil War is because Native men were not to vote until 1924, when the Snyder Act was enacted and admitted Native Americans as US citizens, as backwards as it sounds. Zooming through history as well, another big point of voter access and restriction was our women's suffrage movement. So who could vote at this time? Men only. So women were not okay with that as well. And so we deserve our rights in society as well. So in 1848, there's the Seneca Falls Convention organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and voting becomes a main focus of the overall women's rights movement. And suffragists, not suffragettes, that was a kind of a derogatory term, suffragists worked for women to secure the vote. And the 19th Amendment in 1920 grants women the right to vote. And that's only, that's 100 years, y'all. That's not that, not that far. So we see as more people get rights, as voting access expanded to more people, we see more voter suppression and tactics occur. We see the traditional base who wants to hold power and maintain a social order and maintain the society that they envision. They see it crumbling before them. Women are getting rights, Black people are getting rights, it's overwhelming. This is not the America of how it was designed to go. So naturally, it must be stopped. So ways that they tried to stop this new access to voting, we call them voter suppression tactics. Traditional ones include the poll taxes, which required voters to pay a fee before casting a ballot, and this intentionally disenfranchised poor Black people in the South who could not afford to vote. Black people were just released from bondage, from chattel slavery, into no opportunities. And so people took advantage of that when there was no economic wealth for Black people. Literacy tests, as well as we talked about earlier, education is power, and reading was prohibited among enslaved people. And so literacy tests were implemented at a lot of polling sites in the South, in the Reconstruction South, that targeted Black people who could not read after enslavement. And gerrymandering, which again, we still see to this day, but election districts being drawn in a way that advantages one person, one party, or one group of the other, one group over another. And this is really, cutting up maps and voting districts based on race or class and grouping people together that will specifically flip the outcome in your favor. So all of this is going on after the Civil War, after women have gotten their rights. And so this is continuing into the Jim Crow era. So here comes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 it saw that there were these discriminatory barriers continuing to prevent African Americans from expressing our right to vote. So the act aimed to prohibit racial discrimination in voting. It banned the use of those literacy tests we talked about. It authorized the Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in states and other elections. But the thing that made the Voting Rights Act of 1965 so successful and so, it protected so many Black people from voter suppression, specifically due to Section 4 of the Act. Section 4 of the Act established a formula, and that formula determined which states had to get permission from the Department of Justice before they can make changes to their voting practices. Before they can change anything about voting in their state, they had to get permission from the Department of Justice. So the states that were identified based on the formula as having a history of race-based voter suppression were then subject to meet the requirements in Section 5 before they could make voting rights practice changes. So it was really that if you had a history of race-based voter suppression, you had to run it through the federal government before you could make any changes in your state to prevent that continual cycle that we see. However, the safeguard that we had that protected so many people of color, protected Black voters specifically, was completely stripped and thrown away from us in 2013. In 2013, we see the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder. And in this decision, the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by striking down Section 4 that established that formula that they had to get permission to make changes. And since Section 4 is gone, voter suppression tactics disproportionately affect people of color are running rampant all over the nation as we speak since 2013, but really in the last year as well, in the last couple months, we're seeing voter suppression like never before. And the reason that the Supreme Court said that Shelby County versus Holder, they said that the formula was out of date. They said, you know, you can't judge a state based on 40 years ago of its actions. And so, you know, they said we need to have a more modern formula to determine who needs to get permission before they change voting requirements. So since Shelby County versus Holder and the fall of Section 4 in the Voting Rights Advancement Act, like I said, voter suppression is running wild. Today we see it in various forms. I'm just gonna name a few, but this is not an extensive list of all the ways we're seeing voter suppression play out. One way is voter ID laws. Over 21 million US citizens don't have a government issued photo ID. And they're not always accessible to everybody. Like some people just don't have cars or have the means to access to go to different places to get that government issued ID. After the Shelby v. Holder decision, the next day, Texas enacted a voter ID law that made 600,000 people ineligible the very next day to vote due to a new law they placed on voter IDs. Some other popular voter suppression tactics we see today are voter registration restrictions, you know, limiting the time in which people can actually register to vote or get absentee ballots. Georgia used to have an exact match system, and your name had to match on your registration the exact way that it appeared on government records. So even like an accent mark or anything like that would have disqualified you, and that again disproportionately affects people of color. Voter purges, almost 16 million voters were purged from the rolls. Voter purges are healthy and normal when they are done in the right way, you know, removing people who are deceased or may have moved from the state. But we're talking about a whole nother different level of voter purges. This is just between 2 years. This is 2014 and 2016. The data is way crazier now, but just in those 2 years, almost 16 million voters who were eligible and should have remained on the rolls were removed. We also see poll closures occurring, poll location closures in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, so that people have to travel to more affluent and white neighborhoods to go vote, and that might be 30, 40 minutes away, so that makes voting more inconvenient. Limiting limited Dropbox access, like again, you have those locations of where you can drop off your ballot at these boxes. A lot of them now are just being limited to these affluent neighborhoods, and there might be one within every 50 miles. And I did see in the chat as well that somebody just said about Native Americans as well with voting. North Dakota had passed a law, I think it was like 2018, saying that if you didn't have a physical address, you could not register to vote. Well, who did that affect? Native people on the reservation. I'm telling you, there are no physical addresses. Everybody where I was at and where I lived in my family is, everything is PO boxes. The post office doesn't go out into these homes. So that was an attempt to restrict Native voices, absolutely. And it is getting worse daily. As of March 24th, just last week, there have been, in 2020, this is 2020 alone, 361 bills introduced by the states in 47 states that are meant to restrict voter access. That is 108 more than the 253 number you might have been hearing about here lately. They were saying it in the S1 hearing, and we'll talk about Before the People Act in a second. But that is a 43% increase in less than a month. It is running like wildfire. It is a nationwide GOP attempt to undermine democracy. And we see this as a direct correlation between high Black voter mobilization and turnout from the 2020 election, especially the work of Miss Stacey Abrams. When people of color vote and produce results, elections then become fraudulent. That's the trend that we see. When Black people vote, turn up, show out, the election was rigged. The election was fraudulent if they win. If they don't win, then it was all good. And that resource that I use to track bills, and we use the FCNL to track voter suppression bills, if you're interested in keeping up in real time, the Brennan Center has the state voting bills tracker of 2021. And now I'm going to talk about a law that you are probably very familiar with, and maybe some of you are hearing about this for the first time. So I'm glad that we're here to talk about it because this is happening. This has happened in the last week. So Georgia passed State Bill 202, and it does a lot of horrific things when it comes to voter suppression. And again, Georgia is where we saw such a high turnout of Black voters. We saw such a mobilization in Black communities. Not just Stacey Abrams, there are so many people and grassroots workers in Georgia who really did their part and showed out to make the runoff elections a success for Senators Ossoff and Warnock, but also just to have Black voters participate. And that's when we see Georgia come out with bills like SB 202. A couple things that it does. The period for requesting an absentee ballot is now shortened. Runoff elections are now reduced by a couple weeks. Absentee ballots must be counted by 5 p.m. the very next day after the election. No mobile voting buses for early voting. Drop-off boxes are only available during early voting periods and at those locations. And it limits drop-off boxes by population. We've also, this has been very popular in the news, but passing out food and water has been criminalized. You can get arrested for giving someone water. And we know that Black people had to wait in these lines that were like 7 or 8 hours long in Georgia because there were no polling locations in their area, and they had to travel very far, thus creating these very long lines. And obviously you're going to need food and water, but this is to deter this from happening, from this voter turnout occurring. It also empowers states. This is a very scary one. It empowers state officials to take over local election boards. And basically that means that, yeah, state officials, Republican officials get to take over local elections. And I just wanted to highlight a group that the Georgia ACLU and another organization, I'm not remembering, have partnered to they're called the Peanut Gallery Initiative, and there's county members all throughout Georgia, and you can sign up as well if you'd like, if you're in Georgia. And you can monitor those future meetings that they have, those local election board meetings, to make sure that nothing varies, like nothing like is going on in a way to suppress people. So it's like a watchdog kind of group to make sure to hold election officials accountable. And another stricter ID requirements for Georgia and Georgians as well. Voter suppression is basically violence. It is violence. When Governor Kemp signed SB 202, he signed it in front of a slave plantation portrait in Wilkes County. You can see to your right in that image. So there's white supremacy, really just looking over and watching its manifestation in modern days occurring, living out in front of it. Like we talked about, Black political power is seen as a threat, point blank period. It was never meant to happen in the first place. So now that it's happening and working, it must be shut down in the eyes of white supremacy. So we see the arrest of Representative Park Cannon, who represents a part of Atlanta, being arrested for knocking on the door while the governor signed the bill that is going to actively strip her of her rights. So it's just very, very disheartening to see, but not uncommon. It allows Republicans, like we were talking about those local election boards being taken over by state officials. It essentially allows Republicans to seize control of how elections in counties like Fulton County, which is a home to Atlanta. It's disproportionately Black. It's a very Black neighborhood comparatively to the rest of Georgia and other heavily Democratic areas. It allows them to disqualify voters and ballots as they see fit. Now they're in charge of their elections, places like Fulton County. So what can we do? What can the federal government do? A good bill that we're working on and that we really strongly believe in is the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Used to be called the Voting Rights Advancement Act, or HR 4. It's now known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And it does that very, very, very necessary thing that we need. It restores Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it modernizes that formula to meet the Supreme Court's requirement to determine which states and localities have a pattern of discrimination. So I think it's like the past 15 or 20 years now instead of like the past 40 years. And already passed the House last Congress. It passed the House, yes, in the 116th Congress, but it has yet to be introduced in the 117th. But we'll keep our eye open for it and we'll advocate for it. The bill that everyone is talking about, and we are very, very, very excited about because it's kind of a one in a century piece of legislation, is is S1 or HR1, the For the People Act. It is a large bill that would, part of it would protect and expand voting rights. And there's a whole bunch of things that it does on the screen. I'm not going to read them all for you, but just a whole bunch of things that would very much expand voter access, you know, having same day voter registration, making election day a federal holiday, ending partisan gerrymandering, very important things. The bill also, that's probably the most popular part of the bill. It's like almost like 800 pages, but it also deals with campaign finance and ethical government as well. But this is a part that is very needed and very necessary in today's times. And about HR1 and S1 for the People Act, some great news as well that it passed in the House last month, the same night that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was passed in the House in the first week of March. HR1/S1 has been introduced, S1 has been introduced into the Senate, and the S1 hearing was a success led by Senator Klobuchar, and we had strong opening statements from Senator Schumer. And more exciting news, 49 Democrats have co-sponsored the legislation, all except for Manchin of West Virginia, who has so much attention on him right now. And floor action should be coming soon for a vote for S1 potentially next month. But there are challenges that we have to overcome in this for Senate passage. We need 60 senators. Again, we don't even have all the Democrats yet. We need 60 senators to break the filibuster. And when it comes to the filibuster, it's very important if you're talking to people about it who may be unsure about abolition or reform to the filibuster. It has been historically used to block civil rights legislation. That has been a very big use for it in the past in Congress. So much so, President Obama and President Biden have both called it a relic of Jim Crow, and you'll hear that as well. And it's blocked legislation, specifically anti-lynching legislation, for decades. It was, there's bills introduced for years and years and years, like were continually blocked by the filibuster. Mainly legislation meant to empower Black people. It has been used for historically.
Right, we're gonna pause for another 2 minutes or so to share some more reflection prompts here. Hope you'll be able to jot down some notes about what's rising for you and discuss them when we go into breakout rooms at the end of the session. But I'll invite us into silence. All right, friends, I know that probably wasn't enough time to complete a thought, but we're going to keep moving because we have one more brief section of content before we'll talk about what it means and looks like to start moving from learning to action together.
All right, so we talked about our main kind of work that we've been doing for the last year at FCNL regarding policing and democracy reform. But I did want to highlight on there's so much work in justice reform to be done and that we are doing as well. A recent one that we've had, we've been at FCNL advocating for the lift on Pell Grants for years and years and years. And it was lifted last year. The 1994 crime bill prohibited incarcerated individuals from accessing federal Pell Grants. Well, now that ban has been lifted, so now there's more second chances for people in prison to gain an education. We're currently working on as well lifting the ban on SNAP, which is food assistance program, and TANF, which is the cash assistance program for people with prior felony drug convictions. Right now, they cannot access SNAP or TANF if you have a prior felony drug conviction, which really sets people up for failure who are trying to re-enter into society and establish themselves. So we think that that's punitive and we're trying to get that removed as well. We're also have been working on decarceration efforts during COVID. Prisons have been hit incredibly hard due to COVID and scary, alarming rates. And as Quakers, we believe there's that of God in everyone. And so, people who are incarcerated also deserve to not be subjugated to this virus and be confined in these small spaces. So we're advocating for home confinement when appropriate for some people, immediate release of the elderly and medically vulnerable people who are stuck and cannot socially distance in places that are usually not sanitized, and early release of people who are within 18 months of their release date.
So we're going to skip that reflection section and move into a little bit of from learning to action. So we've covered a lot of content tonight, and I hope that it gives you some food for thought and give yourself some time to let it sink in and see what rises for you. But I want to talk a little bit about what we can do and how we can do it best. Part of advocacy work is discerning when and how it's most appropriate and effective for us to take action. There's a really fine line between acting in solidarity with marginalized communities and co-opting stories or taking up space when you hold more privileged identities. I'll say from my own Quaker perspective, I do believe that we have a responsibility to act on our faith and values. At our annual meeting back in November, when we brought several hundred people together to advocate for an end to police violence, we had Sharice Bach give a message. She says in that message, quote, "When we say there is that of God in everyone, when we say Black Lives Matter, when we say we stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized, those are intensely relational and profoundly economic and ecological claims that place on us a responsibility of shared use, rights, justice, and care." So friends, we have a charge to act in integrity with our stated values. But questions around allyship and solidarity remain. In my view, there are a few ways to look at it. Marginalized people and voices should absolutely have access to the experience of lobbying, of publishing LTEs, of all of the advocacy work that FCNL does. And those voices and stories should be centered and amplified whenever possible. But I also want to say there's a difference between taking up space and centering yourself and speaking from your own experience and values to act in solidarity, to amplify voices that are too often sidelined, as long as you can stay grounded in accountability to those communities and keep pushing the envelope on issues of peace, justice, and equity. Personally, one way I see this too is leveraging privilege. I do have a responsibility to leverage whatever sort of privilege and advantage that I have as a white schooled male, to speak truth to power and to listen and find common ground with power brokers who may be less dangerous or cause less harm to me than to my queer and trans BIPOC siblings. And one part of our approach that really helps with this discernment and this accountability, at FCNL, we believe that stories we tell for advocacy should really be from our own experience. We're mindful to talk about our own values, our own stories, and using I statements to avoid assuming and appropriating others' experiences and stories, enacting white saviorism, or any other sort of potential pitfalls in doing this work. Quaker voices can be like incredibly powerful. I've practiced this and seen it myself, and they can be used to advocate in a way that supports but doesn't drown out the voices of affected people. For me, a main takeaway is just to listen to center, and to lift up marginalized voices, but to not let sort of white guilt paralyze you and make you disengage and hide your own light under a bushel, because we need everyone's voice in this long game of advocacy, including all of yours. I also want to take a minute to share some of the actions that, Cameron presented beautifully on the foundations of systemic racism and their contemporary manifestations, and some of the work that FCNL is helping to lead at the national level. But your story, your values, your faith, your vision for a more equitable society can be used for advocacy with us. You can contact Congress about these bills we're advocating for. You can schedule a lobby visit and work with us to prepare to bring messages to Congress that they need to hear. You can write an LTE, a letter to the editor, or an opinion piece, even draft a meeting minute or on your commitment to anti-racism and racial justice, or write more specifically about these specific policies and provisions that could really start to transform this massive racist system that's entrenched in policy. And we're here to support you in however you are led to take those actions. But I do also want to make a little bit of space here and invite Phil to talk about his experience doing some of this solidarity and accompaniment work. Phil?
Thank you, Bobby. I guess the one thing I want you to kind of take away from my experience is everyone has a different comfort level. You can be an ally and do important support work without really getting personally involved. You can, do the lobbying, write the letters, make the phone calls, send money to Stacey Abrams. But to really be a true ally, you need to develop relationships with people in the affected communities. And building relationships is not something that happens quickly. I've been attending the meetings of the local NAACP branch now. They meet twice a month. There's a general membership meeting 1 week, and then the executive committee meetings, which are open, is also in the month. So every other week I've got a meeting. And I've been doing that faithfully now for more than 3 years. When I first started showing up, they were polite, but guarded. And it has taken a long time for them to come to trust me and to give me permission to do little things. I have, for instance, admin privileges on their local Facebook page where I can share news stories. But I really think that putting the time in to develop the personal connections is the most important work we can do. We can sit in the comfort of our living room and write checks and send letters, and that's all well and good. But it's going to take more than that. As white folks, and as speaking personally as a white overeducated male, professional, a former attorney, we, as Bobby said, we can use our privilege in important ways. And I just hope that folks can bring themselves to that point of dipping their toe in the water. And I think you'd be surprised at how welcoming people will eventually be. Just bear in mind that it's the NAACP is an organization of colored people. It's to be led by people of color. They were looking, for instance, for committee chairs and approached me, and I said, nope, I'm not going to be a committee chair. I'm here to be an ally, but this is an organization of of people of color, and it needs to be led by people of color. I mean, it was flattering to be asked, but I think that as allies, we need to know what the boundaries are. And I think too that you need to go in being mindful of cultural differences. It took me a long time to get used to their way of doing business. It is the diametrically opposed to a Quaker business meeting, let me tell you that. People talking on top of each other and laughing, but it works. So have faith, jump in and enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phil, for sharing. I think we've come to the point of breakout rooms. So I'm going to send us off to breakout rooms and put these prompts on the slide in the chat so that you have them for reference. I think that the instructions here is that I hope that there'll be about 3 or 4 people in each breakout room, or 2 to 3 people in each breakout room, actually. I hope you'll appoint a timekeeper so that you can continue to use time equitably between yourselves and make sure to share airtime and give each person some space to share and reflect in response to these prompts. But I'll read them before I open the rooms. What's something you learned about the foundations of systemic racism, policing, voter suppression, and broader justice reform? Something that stood out to you. What made you most passionate to take action in one or more of these areas? What resonated in your heart the most or upset you the most? And I hope you'll also be able to work as a small group to start moving from learning to action. Share an idea. What's one small action you might commit to taking to support a common vision for racial equity and justice? And with that, I will open up the breakout rooms and I'll see you back here in just about 15 minutes. And then we'll wrap up with some brief announcements and housekeeping, and we'll close out our time together. Thank you so much for coming and bringing your full presence tonight, friends. I've really appreciated it. Oh, I don't think I assigned you, Phil. I apologize. let me, oh, maybe I can't assign you. Maybe it's because you're a co-host.
Who, me? Oh.
No, I think Phil. I don't.
No, I'm not in a room. Is anybody else not assigned?
No, I think everyone else is assigned.
It was. There should just be 2 ladies. And
I got kicked out.
You got kicked out? Oh no.
Yeah.
Let's see.
It just totally flopped me out.
Oh no. Well, I will assign you to a room now. Let's see if that works.
Diana should be in room 8.
Oh, interesting. My bad. It's interesting, Phil. Yeah, I'm not sure why you're not coming up on my my breakout room list.
That's all right. I'll take a break.
That's fair. Thanks so much for sharing, by the way. I think that was really helpful. It always seems helpful for friends to hear from other local friends to get that peer support.
Yeah, and the personal stories, I think, really make a difference.
thank you for sharing that, because again, I think it does make, there's so many concepts and abstract things and systems and all that stuff, and it's just a lot, I think, for people to conceptualize into actionable, things that you can do. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I used to do a lot of public speaking and did what you did, throwing numbers at people. And that reaches some people, but then there are some people who are just reached more by a personal story, by a heart-to-heart connection. So it's not that one is better than the other. They're both important, but some are more effective in reaching certain mindsets.
You're so right.
But this is going really well. We had, I was watching, I believe 47 participants, which definitely exceeded my expectation.
Thank you for showing up and being in solidarity. That's amazing things.
And thank you so much, friends. I hope you enjoyed your time in breakout rooms. We've come to the end of our time together and a little beyond it. But I do hope you all made some connections in your breakout groups and will continue to stay connected as members of monthly meetings and of Southeastern Yearly Meeting as you continue this work in your local communities and your regional community. I want to reshare one last time our FCNL workshop guest book. If you are able to sign this and just give us your email, I'll be sure to follow up with everyone who attended this session with some more content that we presented tonight, some of the reflection questions for your continued learning and deepening, and we can go from there. I also want to say, you can raise a lot of these issues in your meeting, in your local communities, with your family members. It really connects to the way that FCNL lobbies actually, you go and you expect it will be uncomfortable. People will maybe disagree, but those skills and those practices also apply when you're having hard conversations about systemic racism and initiating change in your own communities. And I want to close by just saying I'm here if you have any questions or would like to request any assistance in your advocacy work to dismantle systemic racism. FCNL is here. We've got your back. Reach out if there's anything we can do to better equip you to speak truth to Congress or to other lawmakers and decision makers. And with that, friends, I'll close us off by saying, go forth, be well, and know you are beloved. And we'll see you next time.
And on behalf of all of our friends, I want to thank you, Bobby and Cameron, for doing this. It was a wonderful workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Bobby.
Bye, folks. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks again.
Bye. Bye, Karen. Caroline. Bye, Cerise. Bye, Tony.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Kim.
Terrific.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
Phil. Bye, Phil.
Hey, Phil. Hey,
Bye,
Steve.
John.
Hey, Caroline.
Bye, Jack.
Hey, Bill.
Hi, Tony.
Gail. Hey, Gail.
I just met a lady who was part of founding
Warren and Andrew.
NAACP chapters in North Carolina
Very good.
in the 50s. Now, you talk about a Quaker. Yes. And a white girl with an African-American pastor, okay? All over the state. Can you imagine that?
Very nice.
Yes, very cool.
Nice indeed.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Andrea and Warren.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bill,
Night.
Hey,
Jack's
Jack.
trying to log on.
Hi and bye, I should say.
Good night, sis.
Thank you, Phil, for
Good
making
night.
it possible. Thank you.
Hi, Tony.
Yep.
Cease, how you doing?
Jack's trying to
You're-
log on.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
In meeting for all. How do I?